That night, 1631, Baltimore, Ireland, did not wake to the sound of roosters. It jolted awake at 2 in the morning to a scream that tore straight through the fog. In the darkness came men speaking a language no one there had ever heard. Pirates from North Africa, dragging people from their beds. Men, women, children. Iron chains scraped across stone, cold as the sound of metal dragged over teeth. And before the sky even had time to change color, the whole village had become a single, shackled column, pushed down to the shore, forced onto ships, bound for Algeria. Among them was a young woman named Joan Broadbrook, a girl who had never, in her entire life, left her village. And only 3 weeks later, she would be standing on a raised platform in the slave market of Algiers, while unfamiliar eyes moved in circles around her. But the most haunting part wasn't that they took her. It was this. When the gates of the Haram closed, what exactly happened to women like Joan that European history deliberately learned to fall silent about? No one in Baltimore had time to understand what was happening. In the low-roofed houses, fire flared up so fast, as if the wind had been waiting for it for years. A dull red light swept across faces still sticky with sleep, eyes wide open, yet unable to believe. Children cried until their throats went raw, yanked from blankets, shivering from cold, shaking from fear, while the adults' screams around them warped into a sound that was no longer language. Joan Broadbrook was pulled out of her own life the way you tear cloth from a loom. She had never seen the sea except from far away, staring at gray water. She had never imagined that beyond the horizon there was a world you could travel to, only to have it come back and take you. That night, she only had time to feel the rope cinch tight around her wrists, so tight the blood surged upward, as if it wanted to burst through her skin. And the smoke clinging to her hair, to her clothes, to her memory. The smell of something burned, so there would be no road back. When the ship left shore, Baltimore behind them slowly sank into darkness. Even the barking dogs faded away. Only the sound of water slapping against wooden boards. Slow. Heavy. Like a heartbeat that didn't belong to any human being. And below deck, bodies in chains pressed close together, breathing in short, salty gasps, reeking of tears. Night stretched on, then day, then another day. No one knew where they were being taken. They only knew they were being taken. 3 weeks later, Algiers appeared like a white wound under the sun. The walls blazed so brightly Joan had to squint, as if needles were stabbing her eyes. The air was different here, dry and salty. Sea salt mixed with the sweat of the harbor, mixed with the sharp bite of strange spices creeping into the nose. Voices crashed into each other like a shattered market, and not a single sound was familiar enough to hold on to. And then, what she saw. The slave market. It wasn't tucked away. It wasn't hidden. It was there, in the light. Public. Legal. They led her up onto a high platform and set her down the way you set down merchandise. Buyers circled. Their eyes didn't meet her eyes. They studied her arms, her shoulders, her skin. Hands reached out to test, like testing the strength of wood. One man squeezed her upper arm to judge her power. Another hooked fingers under her chin and lifted, like raising a window to look inside. Every touch felt cold. Not because their hands were cold, but because inside those touches, there wasn't even a trace of anything that could be called human. Joan didn't know what she was worth, but in that marketplace, they priced her at 8 cows, less than a good horse, a number so brutal it killed her name, killed her past, killed even the days she once spent worrying about harvests in a small village along the Irish coast. But Joan wasn't an isolated case. From 1530 to 1780, more than 1 million Europeans were captured and sold into slavery in North Africa and across the Ottoman world. Spaniards, Italians, French, and even people from places as far as Iceland, Ireland, lands many Europeans themselves had never truly imagined. And what was most terrifying was this: the captors were not scattered bandits, not a hungry, desperate mob acting on impulse. They were predators with backing, operating from strongholds like Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, Salé, an organized network, with ships, with guides, with informants. In the shadows of trade and diplomacy, a profession ran quietly and mercilessly. Every body sold became profit, became tax revenue, became a stream of money flowing inward. Not just pirates, a machine. Their fleets could arrive 30 ships at a time, like a flock of black birds dropping over the coastline. They chose night, or the thin edge of dawn, when villages slept deepest, when guards drifted half awake, when even a church bell, if it rang, came too late. Like a call for the dead. They took gold, they took food, but the real target was always people, because objects can be sold once. But a human being, sold, used, then sold again, until there's nothing left to take. Imagine that fear soaking into coastal life for 250 years. Each night, laying down to sleep, people didn't just pray for fish. They didn't just pray for storms to pass. They prayed their door would not be kicked in. They prayed tonight's screaming would not speak their name. They prayed dawn would still be dawn, and not the moment they'd be chained in a line, herded to the shore like livestock. And the truth is, in some years, that fear stopped being imagination. In 1627, they reached all the way to Iceland, the far north of Europe, and took 400 people from an island many couldn't even place on a map. In 1544, the corsair leader Hayreddin Barbarossa attacked the Italian coast and carried off 7,000 people in a single summer. Not a raid, a harvest. In 1554, they struck the town of Vieste and took 6,000 people, emptying an entire town in one night. Numbers like that can seem lifeless when you read them, but every number is a house left behind with its door hanging open, a stove with its fire snuffed out mid-meal, a child's shirt dropped in the dirt, a mother who didn't have time to hold her baby, a man dragged away, gasping, hearing iron chains scrape stone, and realizing his life had changed owners. People began abandoning the sea. Coastal villages slowly hollowed out. Watchtowers rose like bones along the horizon, eyes always fixed on the water. Church bells became funeral horns, and bells can ring. But the helping hand doesn't always arrive, because the predators learned quickly too. They bribed the worst people in the region to learn which villages were weak, which nights rough seas kept fishing boats ashore, which moments came right after the villagers collapsed from harvest labor. And worst of all, some Europeans, traders, converts, men who switched sides, became guides. They knew the language. They knew the customs. They knew the weak points. They opened the door and let the darkness in. One name among them was repeated like a curse. Simon the Dancer, a Dutch captain who turned to serve the corsairs, became one of the wealthy men of Algiers, and with his own hands captured and sold thousands of his own countrymen. Money, that lifeless metal, replaced every loyalty. And inside the turning wheels of that machine, Joan Broadbrook was only a single leaf caught in a black current. She didn't know that the day she stood on that platform in Algiers was only the gateway to something darker, a longer journey, a door that would close behind her, and ahead, No church bell would ever reach her again. There is a moment, right before someone is sold, that people rarely talk about. Not because it doesn't matter, but because it's too easy to make the heart turn away. The kidnappers don't lead their captives straight to the auction platform. First, they march them through public bathhouses. Hot water slides over skin like a counterfeit mercy. Scratches and bruises are treated, not to heal, but to keep the body alive long enough to be traded. Soap mingles with dried blood, with the old, soaked-in scent of fear, a smell that water can't wash away. Then they are sorted. Young, strong men, sent toward forced labor, toward the oared ships where people are chained to the benches until shoulders split, backs bend, and breath becomes a groan. Those with education are weighed like higher-priced goods, tutors, craftsmen, better, but still objects. Children, trained into servitude, sometimes renamed, their language replaced, their memories reshaped, growing up without knowing where they once belonged. And women. Women over 35 are often pushed into quiet work, in kitchens, in courtyards, in rooms no one looks into. But girls from 15 to 30, they are pulled into the bright center of the market, as if the light was built for one purpose only, to expose. Before the sale comes the inspection. They are led up onto a high platform in the square. From up there, the market is no longer a market. It becomes a circle of eyes. Buyers walk around them, hands rough as wood, eyes cold as stone. They squeeze arms, squeeze legs, testing strength. They force mouths open to check teeth. They study every patch of skin like a product that might be defective, and in places like Algiers or Tunis, many buyers demand to see them without concealment, as if a human being's shame is nothing more than cloth getting in the way of a price. A French priest named Pierre Don, who went to Algiers in 1634 to ransom captives, wrote down what he saw. He described Christian women brought into the open crowd, handled and groped to check their health, and any resistance crushed with the whip in broad daylight before thousands of watching faces, like a legalized ritual. If you try to place yourself in that exact position, not as someone standing outside, but as the one standing on the platform, you begin to understand why the fear here is not only fear of pain. It is the feeling of having the most basic thing stolen, the right to be regarded as human. Joan Broadbrook stood on that platform, a girl from a small village where everyone knew one another's names, where the worst worry had once been whether the harvest would come in on time, where a man's hand, if it touched you at all, touched you at a wedding, in your own language, speaking your name correctly. Now the voices around her were only sounds like words striking stone, and the hands that touched her needed no permission, no reason, no words. In the end, Joan was sold to a Turkish merchant named Ahmed for the price of 8 cows. She didn't understand what 8 cows meant. She didn't understand that Ahmed already owned 7 other slaves. She only understood, with a cold understanding that required no literacy, that her life had just been stamped and sealed. But Joan was not the only woman ground through that mill. In 1731, a Dutch woman named Maria Terrelan, 22 years old, was seized while traveling on a merchant ship near the coast of Spain. Corsairs came aboard at dawn. Men over 40 were judged useless, not worth money, not worth feeding. Those bodies were thrown into the sea like rotten timber. The young were chained, women were chained. Then the ship turned south. Maria was locked below deck for 17 days, chained together with around 40 other women. So cramped they could not lie down. They sat folded in on themselves, back pressed to back, head dropped to knees, in a darkness so thick it felt solid. The air became only stench, vomit, urine, sour sweat, and another smell, the smell of fear when it begins to ferment. No light, no wind, only the hull creaking like an old beast, and the crying of women speaking languages Maria couldn't understand. But some things don't need translation. The strangled sound of someone trying not to sob, the sudden gasp when chains jerk, the abrupt, unnatural silence of someone who has finally collapsed. Some did not survive that voyage. Maria heard dragging, then the splash, a body tossed into the sea. In 17 days, she counted 7 times like that. 7 full stops falling into salt water. A woman beside her stopped eating on the 3rd day, stopped drinking on the 5th. By the 8th, she wasn't breathing anymore. Maria had to sit chained next to a body gone cold for hours until the guards finally noticed and hauled it away, like pulling damaged goods from a storeroom. When the ship reached Algiers, they dragged Maria up onto the deck. She hadn't seen sunlight in over 2 weeks. The brightness stabbed her eyes like needles. When her vision returned, the first thing she saw was Algiers' white walls shimmering. The second was the market. The market is always waiting, as if it never sleeps. And in a place like that, everything happens with cruel speed. The bathing, the ointments, the sorting, the platform. Human beings reduced into units, units of health, units of youth, units of usable. Joan passed through it. Maria passed through it. And then, after that moment of being priced in daylight, another journey begins. Longer than the first. A road whose very name made many women go cold inside. Because from Algiers, there was still a path to the east, to Istanbul, to thick doors and deep corridors where people said silk and fragrance could cover anything. But there are pains, even wrapped in silk, that are still only pain. From Algiers to Istanbul was 6 weeks at sea. 6 weeks not to travel, but to be worn down. Joan was locked below deck again, this time with nearly 20 other European women. Italian, Spanish, French, Greek. No one spoke English. Her questions fell into empty air, like rain striking stone. But fear doesn't need language. It passes from one body to another, through a glance, through shallow, ragged breaths, through fingers curling tight around iron. Some of them had already survived the market in Algiers, and it was they who tried, with broken gestures, to tell Joan what waited ahead. Hands shaped what words refused to carry. A finger to the throat, a palm to the chest, a point into the dark, and then a face turning away. One woman cried without sound. Another stared at the wooden planks as if, by looking long enough, her soul might slip free of her body. And so the ship crawled across the sea like a funeral cart. When they reached Istanbul, they didn't pass through any gate meant for guests. They were taken straight to Ahmed's house. The moment Joan stepped inside, she understood. She had entered a place where the name Joan Broadbrook no longer worked. Other slaves, women who already belonged to this house, grabbed her immediately. They pulled her away. They stripped off her European clothes, and they burned them. Flame ate cloth, smoke rose, and for one brief moment, Joan watched her past turn to ash. A small fire, but loud enough to say there was no way back. The stench of burning fabric mixed with incense, with warm water, with oil. A scent that might have seemed gentle, but to Joan it only turned her stomach. Because it wasn't the smell of home. It was the smell of replacement. They washed her in perfumed water. They dressed her in Ottoman clothing. The fabric was soft, but on her skin it didn't feel soothing. It felt like a new hide forced onto her, sealing away everything she had been. When she looked into the water's reflection, she didn't recognize herself. No longer the Irish girl of dirt roads, thatched roofs, and familiar prayers. Then night fell. Night in Istanbul was not night in Baltimore. In Baltimore, night carried salt wind, the creak of wood beneath a roof, the quiet of sleeping people. Here, night was thicker. The air was heavy with scent. Footsteps echoed in the corridor like a warning that could walk. And in one room, Joan sat alone, eyes wide in the dark, listening to her heart pound like a desperate knocking from the inside. That night, Ahmed came. Joan had never been alone with a man who wasn't family. In her village, things like that came only after marriage, with someone chosen, someone who spoke her name the right way. Ahmed didn't speak English, but he didn't need to. Ownership doesn't require words. Years later, Joan managed something rare. She sent a letter back to Ireland, one of the few direct testimonies that remain from an Irish woman taken captive. In that letter, she wrote that she could not describe what she endured on the first night, only that she begged for death 1,000 times, but death did not come, and that every night afterward was the same. That was the reality of the harem, not the romantic paintings Europeans made of places they had never seen. Not silk cushions, perfumed gardens, and luxurious tales, but confinement, forced obedience, and a quiet kind of torture, knowing this could last forever. No army was coming. No bell would reach them. Day after day stretched so long that time stopped feeling like time. Some women went mad. They screamed at walls. They spoke to shapes that weren't there. Other slaves had to hold them down until exhaustion finally took them. And those who could not be controlled were sold or simply disappeared, like a page torn from a book. Others learned to survive by building braces inside their own minds. Small habits, tiny rituals, dust-sized routines, so the day wouldn't dissolve into shapeless mud. They remembered songs from home, the smell of their mother's bread, rain tapping a thatched roof, anything that could keep the outline of the self. But most chose numbness. Numbness is armor. When you can't feel, you're harder to crush. In houses like Ahmed's, the rules repeated, no matter who the master was. First, there was constant pressure to convert. Conversion didn't set them free. They were still property, but it might buy a little treatment that was less bad. Those who resisted were punished. Beatings, starvation, weeks locked in a dark room. Second, they were forced to learn the local language, Turkish or Arabic, depending on the place. Those who learned quickly were sometimes given lighter work. Those who didn't, or wouldn't, were labeled stubborn. And stubbornness was broken. Third, and the nail driven deepest, they had no legal rights. They could not testify. They could own nothing. They could not refuse their master. They could not leave the house without permission. Before the law, they were not a woman. They were an object. From there, the life of a female slave usually slid into one of three grooves: house labor, cooking, cleaning, tending children. 16 hours a day. One wrong meal could earn a beating. One broken bowl could mean hunger. They aged quickly, as if time here scraped at the skin. Or a concubine, used at the master's whim. In wealthy homes, there were many. They were placed side by side not only to serve, but to compete. For a glance, for a shred of favor that might buy one day without blows. If they bore a son, their standing could rise. They might gain a small freedom. But daughters were cheaper, and too many failures meant they would be sold off like discounted goods. Or bought and sold again and again. Each sale was another stripping of a life, another inspection, another owner, another set of rules, another set of punishments. Some were sold 5, 6 times, even 10, and each time was a small death. But among all the terrifying destinations, one name could make even the hardened feel their stomach drop. The Sultan's imperial harem in Istanbul. People spoke of it as a place of power and gold. But the cold records tell another story. A vast complex inside Topkapi Palace. More than 400 rooms, courtyards, baths, kitchens, gardens. At its height, 500 to 1,000 women could live there at once. A city of women, and all of it property. Most were not European. Many were Circassian and Georgian slaves from the Caucasus, considered beautiful by Ottoman standards. But Europeans were still there. Rare. And because they were rare, they were expensive. To enter that world, a girl usually had to be very young, often 12 to 18, and survive a brutal selection. The Sultan's agents moved through slave markets, searching for candidates, buying them, bringing them to the palace for further evaluation. The body examined, health assessed, temper judged, ability to learn measured, ability to please. Most were rejected and sold onward. Only a small fraction were kept. If kept, training began. Turkish, etiquette, music, dance, embroidery, calligraphy. They were taught how to walk, how to speak, how to look, and how to look away. The goal was to shape them into companions worthy of the court. But here, this is where the truth shattered the illusion. Out of those 500 to 1,000 women, only a tiny portion, perhaps 50 to 100, ever truly met the Sultan. And among those, only a handful, maybe 5 to 10 in an entire generation, were ever chosen to stay the night. The rest lived in a terrible limbo, not free, but not chosen. They waited for a summons that might never come. Year after year, they watched youth fall away like leaves inside rooms gilded with gold, and without an exit. And when a sultan died, women who had not borne him children were often sent to the old palace, even more isolated, where they lived out the rest of their lives in seclusion. No leaving, no marriage, no children, only existence behind stone until death. It sounds like a story told to frighten people. But in Ottoman records, there is a name, or rather, a trace. Cold as dried ink. A European slave listed as Francesca. She entered the harem in 1650 at 15. She died there in 1702 at 67. 52 years inside palace walls, never meeting the Sultan even once, never leaving the complex. Her only function, for half a century, was serving those above her. When she died, she was buried in the cemetery for palace slaves. No headstone, no name, only a number in a ledger. Slave number 847. Origin, Franco. Status, deceased. A whole human life folded into a few words, and somewhere in the deep corridors of Istanbul, where silk covered doorways, where perfume lay over stone, perhaps Joan understood something at last. There are prisons that don't need bars, only time. And then the unavoidable question rises, like a black tide. Why did Europe allow this to continue for 250 years? The answer has no single villain you can point to. It spreads out, cold, humiliating, like fog settling over the coastal watchtowers. Europe, at that time, was fractured and weakened. Religious wars between Catholics and Protestants drained people and wealth alike, leaving nations too busy tearing at each other to look toward the sea. They didn't coordinate against the corsairs, because each side feared the enemy on the continent more than the black sails beyond the horizon. And then there were trade arrangements, especially with powers like Venice and France, profits too fat to surrender. for a few fishermen, a few women taken from some poor village. The price of a human being so often weighed less than the price of a cargo, and there were those who benefited from the darkness itself. Renegades who switched sides, merchants who traded goods no matter where they came from, and an entire ransom industry that ran like a cold machine. But ransom was slow, bureaucratic, and it favored only those with money. A rich man's daughter might come home within a year. A poor fisherman's wife might wait her whole life. And most of them really did wait their whole life. Maria Terrelan was considered lucky. After 8 years in captivity, her family sold everything they could sell to gather the ransom. 200 Dutch florins, a fortune for a working household. In 1739, Maria was released and returned to the Netherlands. But when she stepped onto her homeland's shore, what greeted her wasn't an embrace. It was a hollow space. Her fiancé had married someone else. Her mother had died of grief 2 years after Maria was taken. Her father was ruined by the ransom, and her community looked at her the way people look at a stain. A woman tainted, marked, whether what had happened to her was real or only imagined. It was enough to lock every door. Maria lived the rest of her life alone, working as a seamstress. In her diary, preserved in Dutch archives, she wrote that she would rather have died in captivity than return to this life. There, her shame was private. Here, it became public and permanent. Those words don't scream. They simply fall onto the page like ash, thin, gray, and impossible to brush away. That system only truly began to change in the 19th century, when France started firing cannon into corsair strongholds. And by 1830, when France invaded Algeria, the machine was finally cut down for good. But before the blade fell, more than 1 million people had been taken, and most of them never returned. And Joan Broadbrook. Joan lived for many years in captivity, and when she was finally freed, she tried to return to Ireland, the way someone tries to find a dream that has been torn to pieces. But Baltimore, her Baltimore, was gone. That village was erased from her life on the night of 1631, and time only carved the erasure deeper. Houses, family, every face, every road, all of it vanished, as if the sea had swallowed even the memory. Her family in Ireland never learned what happened. For decades, Joan's name was read aloud in Baltimore's church, in prayers for the captured. Every Sunday, her name rang out, like a rope thrown into the ocean. Every Sunday. No answer came back. And then, one day, they stopped reading it. Not because the pain ended, but because a human being cannot carry a call forever, without a reply. And so Joan fell into the most terrifying place of all, being forgotten. But this story isn't only Joan, not only Maria, not only Francesca, who died under the name of slave number 847, no grave marker, only a number in a ledger. It is the story of more than 1 million European women taken out of their lives by a human trafficking system that operated openly for centuries. The Irish coast still remembers the night of 1631, not in words, but in wind, in cliff edges staring into darkness. And in the archives of Istanbul, the names are still there, silent, like fingernails dug into paper. Now, at least, you have heard them. And through the life of the young woman, Joan Broadbrook, we can recognize a few things. 1. Don't wait for someone to come save you before you live again. If there is no rescue force, build one small step yourself, so tomorrow still has a path. 2. Keep something that belongs to you, the way women held on to songs from home, a tiny habit, a page of words, a prayer. so your name cannot be erased. 3. The deepest humiliation is to be forgotten. Do one thing each day that leaves a trace. Learn one thing, finish one task, keep one promise. 4. Fear doesn't disappear. It gets managed. You don't need courage like steel. Only courage strong enough to walk through the hardest 10 minutes of today. 5. Even if you're sold again and again, you're still alive. Failure isn't the end of the sentence. It's only being shoved into a new set of rules you have to learn to survive. Because some of the most dangerous chains don't rattle. They live in the moment we stop calling our own life by its name. So tell me, what do you think saved Joan and Maria day after day? Was it hope? Or was it simply a small habit that refused to die?